Good morning, and thank you again for popping up at the crack of dawn to show up for this. Free will is an important topic for positive psychology. It is not only is one of the most important human capabilities, a defining feature of what makes us human and sets us apart from others, but it's also a means by which we can strive toward our goals and realize our ambitions and fulfillments. Let me see if I've got this right now. Now, free will is a little bit different from some of the other things we study in positive psychology, like happiness and love and so forth. We want to figure out how those work, but usually we don't have to argue with the naysayers that there is such a thing as love. But with free will, many people are questioning it and wondering if this has theological overtones or something like that. Well, my goal, as the title implies, I'm trying to produce a scientific theory. So it's going to be nothing supernatural. So it's working with real stuff that we're familiar with from science, so no souls and things like that. And it's also going to be a causal theory. Scientific theories are causal theories. Some people think free will means you have to get an exemption from causality. It's not going to be deterministic, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but certainly it's going to be a causal theory. Has to be compatible with other stuff that we know in science. Presumably, if it's a human capability, it's something that we acquired in the course of evolution. So we at least have to have some idea of how free will would have evolved. So ultimately, what are we trying to do? The idea is that human beings in evolution acquired some new kind of way of controlling their behavior, of dictating our action. And so we want to have an account for how this came to be and how it works and functions. Something linked to these other processes, presumably rational decision-making, conscious thought, deliberate choice. Somehow it's involving those things. So we have to understand, how did this come about from earlier systems of action control? In terms of understanding just what it is, well, there are many different definitions, and since I've been talking about this topic, I've encountered lots of arguments about whether free will is possible. Usually these are based on really wildly different definitions of what free will is. We want to understand, what is it ordinary people understand by the term? And there are a couple projects like this that have come out. Molly and Monroe asked people to define the term in their own words and debate it and so on. That's very direct. Ours is a little more indirect. We had people write an experience from your own life in which you exercised free will. Just some episode from your own experience in which your actions stemmed from your own free will, and another where it was not of your own free will. And then we could take the two sets of stories and code them and look for the differences. And so in people's own lives, the way they understand free will, these are some of the things associated with free will that differentiate when I acted of my own free will and when I acted not of my own free will. So top of the list, of course, deliberately making a choice. People associate that with free will. Positive outcomes, well, the free will stories were more likely to turn out well and have happy endings than the bad ones. And this goes with the idea that free will helps you get what you want. It's not something that magically appeared in evolution for no reason. No, it has practical value for us to help us reach our goals in new ways. And particularly, it's associated with long-term goals. No difference in short-term goals. Short-term goals are there in the non-free will stories just as well. If you're, to go back to nature, you're being chased by a big animal and just trying to get up the tree before it eats you, well, you don't need free will for that. But pursuing things at a delay, projecting into the future, that's where free will seems to come into play. Reflection, conscious thought, much more implicated in free will. Doing things consistent with your moral values. It's an idea, goes back to Kant, that free will is associated with doing what's morally right. Nature didn't make us do what's morally right, but we acquired the capacity to figure out what's morally right and adjust our behavior accordingly. That's an important step in evolution, so something we call free will is associated with that. And the last couple things, acting against external pressures. I mean, everybody's making you do something, then that's not really free will. And in some way less harmful, more beneficial to your own social group. So free will is positive, pro-social, pro-cultural, by and large, in the way people understand it. All right, so let me spend a little time, as many scientific perspectives are debating, is it even possible? Should we even talk about free will in scientific terms, or is it some concept left over from a pre-scientific way of thinking about the world? Um, we get the topic and the argument from philosophers, and they have certain ways of thinking about free will and arguing about it, but we shouldn't necessarily be bound by these. For one, they want to argue, do people have free will, yes or no? It's an all or nothing kind of thing. Well, in social science, most things are not all or nothing. Most things are on a continuum. So rather than thinking yes or no is going to be the answer to the free will question, we're going to look at, if you forgive the expression, degrees of freedom, that some actions are freer than others. And so what human evolution did was build this capacity so we can be somewhat freer and so on. And free will is going to be perhaps a sometime thing, not a constant always thing. But that's probably a more productive way since most of the phenomena we study occur like that. Also, they spend a lot of time arguing about determinism. Is free will compatible with determinism? Determinism is this view articulated 2 centuries ago. I think this is a wrong turn for us and something we shouldn't really get bogged down in repeating the debate that they do. It turns out most philosophers don't even believe in determinism anymore, but they still spend a lot of time arguing if it can be reconciled with free will. I don't know why they do that. Determinism is this position articulated, as I said, 2 centuries ago, that if you knew that a disposition, the location of every particle in the universe, and you knew all the laws of nature, you could predict the future with complete unerring accuracy at any point in the future, or you could calculate backwards and know the exact past. In other words, the key point is that there's only one possible future, and the rest, the history of the universe is already laid out, already determined, if you will, and has been since the beginning of time, or at least since the Big Bang. Anyway, I think for us to engage in this argument has been a big distraction and probably not that helpful. Many of the arguments are based on misunderstandings of free will, that it involves behavior being caused by your soul or something like that, or that it steps outside of causality. Those are not really productive for us. Likewise, determinism, people want to assert that because they think it just means causality, but it's not causality, it's causal inevitability is the point, that there's only one possible future. Causality alone is not a problem, I think, for free will theory. It turns out there's so many different causes, hundreds and hundreds throughout the sciences, so maybe we should just say free will is one more kind of cause. That's a fairly minor addition and a very plausible one, and just forget it and move on, rather than arguing that it has to be some kind of exception to causality. It's just another of the many kinds of causality. Determinism, moreover, this view that there's only one possible future, is really unworkable for us in psychology. It's not a basis that we can use for explaining behavior, understanding the mind, and so forth. So many of the phenomena that we grapple with in psychology, the things we try to explain, are based on the very idea that there are multiple possible futures. If you want to insist, as the determinist is, that there's only one possible future, it really makes it hard to furnish an explanation of, here are just some lists of things, positive, negative, and indifferent, but the very idea of threat is something might happen and might not happen. Success and failure are only meaningful if each is possible. You don't say that the ice in the sun melted successfully. Wow, yay! It had to happen there. Success is only meaningful if you could have failed, and vice versa. Choice, moral judgment. And moral judgment is typically a judgment about should that person have done something different in that situation. And, well, whether the person should have done something different, it presupposes that the person could have done something different. The determinist has to say, no, the person could not have done something different. Moral judgment's based on assumptions of free will, and on and on and on. Contingencies, such a topic of study in the history of psychology. Negotiation. Negotiation's an important one because again, that's distinctively human. Out in nature, we don't see that. The big animal wants to eat the small animal, and the small animal says, tell you what, just eat my tail, and we'll call it even. And that doesn't really happen. But in human social life, it's very important. Economic trade and political negotiation, and even just negotiating the terms of a good marriage and so on. People understand the other point of view, and they compromise and so on. Negotiation is based on the idea there are multiple possible outcomes, and you look for one that's satisfactory to both sides. So on and on and on. The stuff we study is really based on the idea that there are multiple possible futures. Determinism simply denies that possibility and eliminates the basis for talking about these. So the idea that something might happen and might not happen is essential to the stuff we study, and determinism's contribution is simply to say that, well, that's impossible. I want to add, too, not only is it useless as a basis for understanding mind, our understanding of situation structure is based on multiple possibilities. What are the options? What are the contingencies? What's going on? Agency and control are based on the idea there are different things that could happen, and so I exert myself to make sure this one and not that one happens. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we evolved agency for, and free will as an advanced form of that. We just got to understand what's different rather than trying to deny that there are multiple possibilities. And it's also, determinism doesn't work as a basis for living your life. You have to act as if there are multiple choices. And for the determinist to say, well, you know, what you're going to have for breakfast tomorrow is already predetermined. You know, that doesn't help when you're sitting there with the menu and you really have to make a choice. You really have to figure it out. The other issue with opposition to free will ideas is reductionism, that phenomena at high levels can be explained at low levels. And many people are still tempted to think that ultimately we'll be able to explain everything in the universe based on the laws of physics. The more proximal form of this debate we're familiar with in psychology is if we understand the brain, will that substitute for all other categories of explanation? Once we know how the brain works, can we dispense with studying social life and communication and love and all that other stuff? Can we just see what lights up on this? Well, I think the answer is no to all of these things. I'm very influenced by this paper Philip Anderson wrote several decades ago in Science. Anderson was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And from my understanding, physicists used to think that ultimately physics would explain everything in the universe, and now they don't think that anymore. And this article, which I recommend look up if you're interested, and it's only 3 pages long, and you can get what you need out of the first page. And what he argues is that the different sciences are arranged in a sort of hierarchy. Some are more fundamental than others, with physics being the most fundamental, chemistry above that, and biology and so forth. The higher levels are all constrained by the lower levels, but new causes emerge. New causes come into operation at each new level. So chemistry is not just physics. Probably easier for us to understand intuitively if we understand in what way biology is not just chemistry. As you move from chemicals to life, new sort of causes come into play that are not just chemical reactions. And so as you move to these higher levels, things become more organized in advanced ways. Again, they can't violate the laws of the lower levels, but they move beyond them. No, by understanding the physics of particles, that's not going to explain love and striving and fulfillment and all of that. The argument we're hearing a lot in psychology these days, again, is the idea that once we understand the brain, that will explain everything. And in particular, that seems to rule out free will, because they say, well, the brain works like a little machine. It's got nerve cells that fire based on chemical and electrical events. And they operate in lawful fashion, and the brain causes behavior. And so since the firing of a nerve cell is a lawful scientific thing, then there can be no free will. Again, this is a reductionist argument that doesn't allow for the emergence of higher causes at higher levels of organization. It kind of says you have to reduce everything to the most simple and basic physical things, and that will be enough to understand them. Here's an articulation of that view by Green and Cohen. What if somewhere deep in the brain, they're making fun of the idea of free will, there are mysterious events that operate independently of the ordinary laws of physics, somehow tied to the will of the owner. It's highly unlikely, and by the end they're getting to violating the laws of physics. Oh my God, they're violating the laws of physics. But again, Anderson's schema for explaining this gets around this. They're not independently of the laws of physics. They go beyond them, but they have to respect the laws of physics. They certainly don't violate the laws of physics. Rather, they simply introduce new causes at a higher level of organization that work through the lower levels, and the lower levels are influenced by the higher levels. Here's another Nobel Prize winner, the DNA guy. They're only molecules, everything else is sociology. There are actually 2 ways to read this sentence. One of them is he was trying to be a jerk, and I think this is probably right, which is saying that molecules exist, and too bad sociology doesn't exist, too bad for our colleagues in sociology. But the other view is that, well, maybe molecules are real and sociology is real, and they just operate at different levels. I don't think that's what he meant, but it could be taken that way, and that would be the kind of argument I'm trying to develop, that yes, new causes come into play, that to understand sociological, economic causes and so on. I mean, there really is such a thing as the national debt, but it doesn't have a molecular structure or mass or a location or any of the other physical properties we associate it with. Moving to the idea of molecules and atoms and so on. Chemicals. Think about chemicals for a moment. Here's a list of chemicals. You can get them in jars and put them on a shelf in your laboratory and so on. I picked this particular list of chemicals because these are the chemicals that make up the human body. Now, here's a picture of my daughter. And you can say, well, you know, she's really just this other stuff, oxygen, carbon, she's just a bunch of molecules. And I guess if you push the argument, like the free will argument, since the oxygen and the carbon models aren't alive, she can't really be alive too. I think they're missing something. I mean, she is really alive. And so new causes come into play at the high level of organization. That's where we're going to have to look for free will coming into existence too, with the emergence of new causes at higher level of organization that don't appear when you just look at the atoms and molecules. So the social scientist task, explain how humans got this new form of action control, explain how we deal with situations where there are multiple possible courses of action, multiple possible outcomes. And I think, again, the best thing is to get away from this argument about determinism, which is sort of a useless idea that most people don't believe in anyway. Instead, focus on responsible autonomy. Autonomy means self-government. I mean, the human adult is expected to take care of itself and be autonomous and make decisions for itself, and to be responsible, which means understanding the laws of society, including the rules and the norms and so forth, and either obey them or at least accept the consequences of not doing so. So self-organization moves up from lower levels to high levels. You can think of the Big Bang as the beginning of suddenly there was stuff in the universe organized into matter and force and so forth. In physical systems, if you remember your college physics, always drifts back toward entropy, away from organization over time. A closed physical system will become more stable and chaotic. But with life, things go in another direction. Life is a big step forward in organization. And life, as Schrödinger, also Nobel Prize in Physics, he wrote a book called What is Life? Life is based on negative entropy. Life goes toward more organization, whereas inanimate systems go toward less and less organization. You know, if you leave your house out in the weather and leave the doors open and let the elements take their toll, it will gradually reduce to rubble. But living things, both individually, they strive for a harmonious interaction, stable relationship to their environment. And collectively, look at things like evolution, always moving toward more and higher, more complex levels of organization. So life moves forward toward embracing a greater organization. A step up from that is agency, the small animal's ability to control its action, to assess the difference, impose order on its world. And free will is somehow an advanced form of that. So we see this series of steps toward greater organization from physical matter, and again, the new causes emerging at higher levels. That's how we want to understand free will. And just to look at agency specifically, since that's our focus here, the difference between plants and animals is a big shift. Plants don't need a central nervous system. They don't have very many decisions to make. They don't need to process information from their environment, gather it in one place and make decisions. But an animal can go this way or that. It just needs all of its feet to be walking in the same direction. So it does need central control, and so it has to assess the environment and the options. That's why the central nervous system, the brain, all that stuff really starts with animals. That's why that's a big step forward in agency. And in some way, free will would be a new and advanced version of that's specifically humans evolved, probably for dealing with the new kind of social life that we created, in which we have meaning and shared understandings and the other trappings of culture with systems and stocks of knowledge, things like that. So it's again the basic agency that animals have, added with some new capacities to think and understand and respect the rules of a society. It's a truism in social psychology that we are social animals, and the phrase the social animal goes back to Aristotle, I gather. It's true as far as we go, so we are social animals, but that calls attention to how we are the same as lots of other animals. What about what sets us apart from other animals? What makes us human? What makes us different? And for that, I think the phrase "the cultural animal" is more defining. There's the beginnings, tiny beginnings of culture in a variety of other species, but none make them the center of the way they live the way humans do. That's been our biological strategy. It's how our species solve the basic problems of survival and reproduction. It's by creating culture, by creating society with a system of shared information, interlocking roles, and so forth. So to create and make this system work, we had to have new psychological capabilities, and whatever the reality behind the idea of free will is, that presumably came in there. Culture is a new and better way of being social. So again, we are social animals, but we found a better way of organizing our social life based on meanings, ideas, shared assumptions, and so forth. So it's a highly successful one. Compare all the other mammals, certainly on the planet, where their population has been steadily declining for centuries, and ours is increasing rapidly. Well, you say, if culture is such a great biological strategy, why don't other species pick it up? Well, they can't. As you need more of psychological capabilities to it. It took a lot of competition and a bit of luck for our species to develop the capability to talk and to communicate, understand each other's mental states, and move on from there to science, technology, religion, and the iPhone. The key point here is what makes us human. If we want to understand the essence of human nature, something I've become quite persuaded with, almost all the distinctively human traits, the ones that set us apart from the other creatures on the world, are biological adaptations in evolution designed to enable us to do culture. That's how, again, that's our biological strategy, how we survive and reproduce. Free will evolved to help us function in culture. It evolved because improved survival and reproduction by participating in the social environment, sharing information and so forth, working together. We do much better than we would otherwise. So we participate in systems. Systems only function properly if people follow the rules to some degree. And so that makes the somewhat surprising point that free will is for following rules. And I want to emphasize that for a minute because it sounds a little bit counterintuitive. People think, well, freedom means being able to do whatever you want, not having any rules. But you don't need free will for that. Any animal in the woods is capable of doing what it wants without any rules. What you need a new kind of action control for is to be able to get what you want within a system that has rules. And that capacity seems limited to humans. Here's an optimistic case. We can make rules for dogs. This is spotted locally here in Los Angeles. I think the laws and the sign makers are very optimistic, not only because literacy rates are very low in dogs, but that they would actually start doing their share and cleaning up after their owners, Anyway, you get my point. We can make the rules and we can follow them. Other species are unable to do that very much. So the idea, free will is enabling the enlightened animal to pursue enlightened self-interest, rather, in a social environment that has rules. So you can still get what you want, as our data showed, but do it in the context of the system, working with the system. Okay, and then just to finish up the points, so we need the capacity to follow the rules. That's what makes our system work. That's what, restaurants are a fine institution, a great way to get food. Other creatures would like to have them, but restaurants only work if people follow the rules, if they obey the health code, if they pay for the food that they order, and so on. And likewise, the staff there, the waitresses are not supposed to take bites of the food when they serve it to your table, even if the waitress is hungry and it looks good. Again, though, if you hire dogs for waitresses, when they bring the food to your table, it's probably going to be licked and sniffed and bites taken and so forth. So all these systems only work if most of the people follow most of the rules most of the time. That's what we needed to evolve free will to be able to do. So free in the sense of overcoming the natural instinctive places. It is totally natural if you're hungry and you've got food in front of you to take a bite of it. But if you're the waitress in a restaurant, you got to know not to do that. And likewise, if you're a patron and somebody else's dinner at the next table looks better than yours, just because you're bigger doesn't mean you just reach over and grab it off their plate. So obeying the rules makes these systems work, makes life better for everyone, but they need control for this. Because, this last point here, because we are overcoming nature, we are still animals. We still have all the inclinations and the motivations and capabilities and so forth that other animals do. Because of that, free will is some additional possibility for control superimposed on top of that or beside that. But we still have those things. Because of that, free will be incomplete. We're never going to completely overcome our animal nature, but partial freedom is good enough. Good enough to make the system work, as again, if most people obey most of the rules most of the time. Once again, causality is not the issue here. We want to think, what is it that a human being has to have to function in society? That's the outlines of free will. Responsible autonomy, I think, is the right formulation. That's what society needs people to have, to be able to take care of themselves, to obey the rules, and still get what they want within the system. So new kinds of agency that go beyond what we see in nature and in other animals. Information agent means we share information, we participate. Each animal learns on its own and saves what it does. It looks like animals don't teach much. Sometimes they copy what others do, but they don't really have a sense of, oh, so-and-so has a great idea. They mimic the behavior, but we deliberately share information and discuss it. We have moral agents, again, making decisions based understanding moral principles and ethics and legal rules as well. Economic agents, also unknown in nature, that we buy, sell, and trade, and so forth. All these vital for making society work. So, what I'm arguing so far, social scientists interested in free will should forget about the causality issue, instead focus on responsible autonomy. Now, what brought me to the study of free will was research on self-control. It's a topic I'd been working on for some time, and I'm going to say a few ideas about this, but the idea is that there's several different kinds of agency that seem more advanced, more special to humans, or done in different ways in humans. And they seem to have some common psychological and maybe physiological substrate. So there is something linked among them. That's when we started talking about free will. I began looking at self-control, and when it turned out that some of the same energy, some of the same resource you use for making decisions, you also use for self-control, well, then there's a common basis, and that's when I thought we should look for a broader term and started using the free will terminology. All right, so say just a couple words about self-regulation. It's getting warm up here. Essential idea is this is a way to change your own behavior. You have an impulse to do something, you override that and do something else. You can see the idea, the conceptual beginnings of free will there. You don't have to act on every impulse that pops up in your mind, but you have the capacity to restrain and make a decision to do otherwise. It's a key to understanding what the human self is. It's something, how the self manages itself and moves it forward through life. It's also something, it's not unknown in nature, but it's much more advanced in humans than in other species. I'm referring to self-control. And it's also very adaptive, that people with good self-control show up in study after study as doing better than other people by all sorts of measures. You can look at practical career success, you can look at popularity, you can look at good relationships, durable love life, look at physical health. People with self-control even live longer than other people. So it's a highly useful trait for us. So it means in the kind of world that we have created, this capacity is very useful, very adaptive for making people's lives better. Hence, even before we started talking about free will, self-control, a highly useful and adaptive trait. What emerged from our lab is the idea that it operates on the basis of a limited energy resource, that when people exert self-control, it looks like they use up some of this energy, some of this resource. The basic finding is after they exert self-control in one sphere, if there's another demand for self-control, even on something seemingly quite different, they'll do worse on the second, as if they somehow used up a bunch of the energy, the willpower on the first one, depleted their willpower, and had less left over for the second task. Key point is the same energy, the same willpower, if you will, is used for many different acts of self-control, many different spheres, many different sorts of things, and it gets depleted by all sorts of them. Even small, brief acts of self-control are enough to make a difference, so that the organism is feeling its energy is down a little bit, starts to conserve what it has left. We've looked at decision-making also. That this was the big leap when we went beyond self-control and started to say, well, maybe this does tie into what people are talking about in terms of free will. We found that after people have exerted self-control, not only is self-control impaired, but their decision-making is changed. So when people have used up some of their willpower, how they make choices and decisions is different. Some of the findings, people, first of all, they prefer not to make a decision if they can. They'd rather postpone it, shove it into the future, not make a choice right now. Another difference has to do with compromise, that when people are in full possession of their resources, their energy, their willpower, if you will, people are compromisers, and they will trade off this and that and look for the best spot. Even things like price versus quality, they'll look for where do I get the most value for my money, and so forth. When they get depleted, the compromise goes out the window, and they're just oh, give me the cheapest, or give me the best. They'll pick one dimension and go for an extreme, rather than compromise and trading them off. It's a simpler way of deciding, as the decision-making researchers have told us, and given our complexity and all that, we don't have to do it that way, but when our energy's down, we tend to fall back on that and do things in a simpler way, often to our detriment. There's also irrational bias. I won't go into the asymmetric dominance. That's something the decision-making researchers came up with, but it's a kind of irrational bias, letting your decision be swayed by something that's logically irrelevant. That happens somewhat when people have their willpower, but it happens a lot more when people are depleted. Again, quality of decision-making shifts when people are depleted, shifts toward simpler, low-effort kinds of ways of getting a decision made, but perhaps not as adaptive, not as good a decision. A key point, though, is that the same energy basis, the same resource, seems to be used for self-control and for making decisions. Intelligent thought, we have studies, too, that when people's willpower is depleted, they don't do as well on intelligence tests, especially the kinds of ones that require logical reasoning, that require you to manage your thoughts. I mean, your IQ tests often have a vocabulary section, and your vocabulary is the same regardless of your willpower. It's not like you forget what dilatory means, or I forget what the words are on an IQ test. Automatic processes, getting information from your mind, those seem to function just fine, but the effortful, controlled processes, those suffer, and logical reasoning is one of them. Depleted people do not reason as effectively. Intelligent, rational thought really does seem to be based on the same resource used for self-control. And so that suggests a common mechanism. Probably what happened in emergences, evolution created one and then adapted it for the second. My guess, and I can't prove this, my guess is that self-control evolved first, probably at the level of primates and others to some degree, just because of the requirements of social life. It means adjusting your behavior based on the rules of the group. Well, there are already some rules in primate groups. And so that would be the more fundamental one. Self-control evolved first, and then nature piggybacked the rational choice on top of that. That's a sense figuring out what your own rules should be and adjusting your behavior to follow those. So I'm guessing a speculative scenario of how free will would have evolved in that sense. We also find another extension that depleted being active or passive also draws on the same research, the idea that when people are depleted, they become increasingly passive. I don't have the study here, but we had a variety of experiments for this. That one, the experimenter, first we depleted people by having them do a self-control task or not, and then the experimenter said, well, for the next task, the computer will give you instructions, just follow the prompts. The experimenter hits start and leaves the room, and the computer just goes to blue screen and stays there forever. So the question is, how long does the person sit there staring foolishly at the screen, wishing for something to happen? And again, they sat there twice as long if they were depleted, if they'd used up their, some of their willpower on the first task. So the implication is not only self-control and rational choice use this resource, also initiative, taking it on yourself to be active and try to solve the problem rather than just passively sitting there waiting for something to happen. That too is probably an important form of free will, and that too is tied to the same energy resource, so the same inner process that's going on here. Let me turn now briefly to talk about not only the reality of free will in terms of the processes, but also belief in free will. This too appears to be highly useful for society. There's a variety of data piling up. This was stimulated by a paper by Voss and Schooler about 5 years ago, in which they said, okay, we're not going to argue whether free will is true or not, but we can manipulate people's belief in it. They took some people and tried to convince them with readings and so forth that there's no such thing as free will. Others they told that there was free will. And it turns out people then who had been induced to disbelieve in free will were more likely to lie and cheat on a test, and by doing that steal money from the experimenter. So certain forms of antisocial behavior showed up. We and others have copied this this procedure or adapted it, and a whole set of changes come that people believe in free will. People, let's say, put it this way: people who do not believe in free will are more aggressive toward others. They're less helpful. They conform rather than thinking for themselves. They are less likely to analyze what they did wrong and how they could change their behavior. They're less grateful to others. When you think about it, gratitude. This is something we're working on right now. Gratitude, you're more grateful to the extent that the person did not have to do that. If you think the person had to do whatever he did for you, you may be glad that they did it, but you're not really grateful. Even sort of in fanciful ways, being grateful to nature. Are you grateful when it rains? Well, only if it hadn't rained for a long time and you had a sense that it might never rain again and your crops are dying. It's irrational, but you might have this feeling of thank you for the rain. But this is really something in social life that we're grateful mainly to people for things that they did for us that they did not have to do. All right. So the implication, I don't put those up to say that people who don't believe in free will are bad people, although it doesn't really sound like someone you'd want for a roommate. But it sort of tells us how this belief functions in society. It makes people behave in ways that support the values and the rules of society. And that includes punishing other people who misbehave, but also doing pro-social things, refraining from doing antisocial things. So, this doesn't prove that there is such thing as free will or whatever, but certainly if the findings had been the opposite way, it would be hard to make the argument that free will evolved to help us do culture. But given the results turn out like this, the belief in free will operates that way too. It's beneficial for culture. People do things that are better to make our cultural systems work to the extent they believe in free will. And again, it goes with being responsible and autonomous. Okay, and last topic I'll spend a couple of minutes on. This is work we've just begun doing recently. Why do human cultures all seem to believe in free will? As far as we can tell, that belief starts early in life and is quite universal. Even small children, you can show them a ball rolling down the hill and they say, did the ball have to roll down? And they say yes. And then they say, well, did the woman have to give you the piece of candy? No, she didn't. They know that a person can act differently in a way that a physical object doesn't have choice. That much seems to be universal. And a variety of cultures have been assessed. And in general, the belief in free will is above average, that people do have positive belief in it. There are variations, but the belief appears itself to be pretty much universally found. Why? Why is this so useful then? Why do human cultures believe in free will? What are the causes that create that difference? That's become a recent focus of research. Initially, we focused on what are the consequences of this belief, but since there's so many consequences, now we want to know why is this belief and why there are variations in it. Human society is based only on shared assumptions. We assume that there are rules and that other people will be responsible and will also obey the rules. So restricting your own behavior to comply with the rules, that only makes sense if other people are going to do it too. There's no such thing as private property if you're the only person in the world who respects private property, and so forth. Trust, an important variable that is coming up in a variety of contexts as fundamental. I mean, we understand that the baby has to trust the mother and so forth, and even adult relationship partners, trust is terribly important. But economists are talking about trust and saying, well, really, every economic transaction requires some degree of trust. The buyer and the seller, you have to trust that the other is going to fulfill his or her part of the bargain. And so that's vital to make society work. When trust breaks down, like illegal drug deals or whatever, it's much harder and much more dangerous to pull off the deal, and those things are much more unstable. So trust is a great driver, not just at the individual intimate level, but even at the giant social system, economic marketplace level. Again, the cultural system only functions if most of the people obey most of the rules most of the time. There are people in the economy who cheat others and so forth, but if that became the norm, the economy would break down. As long as there are only a few of those, most people can trust most of the time, and economic transactions can go forward. And the point of economic transactions is both parties are better off. You buy something, you get what you want, the other person gets money, it's advantageous to both. That's a key problem that our species has solved that almost no other species has solved. They have genetic impulses to take care of those that they're related to, but having mutually beneficial cooperative interactions with non-kin, this is a key to the success of our species. And again, things like this are where we want to look for this is why free will evolved and why it functions as it does. Anyway, one idea was, going back to Nietzsche, is that people invented the idea of free will sort of to help enforce this idea that people should obey the rules. And so we may, even though, as I said, free will is for following rules, it'll be most obvious to it, it'll come up to mind when we see people breaking the rules. And we think, no, they should have used their free will to do what was right, that they were making a choice to be selfish or harmful or destructive, and they should have made another choice. That would be the normal choice because, again, in the cultural system, most people obey most of the rules most of the time. We have some data testing this idea. A somewhat cynical version is people made up the idea of free will to blame their neighbors. But it's based on the idea of moral responsibility, that you have to be concerned not just what's the right thing to do at this time, but with your reputation, with getting others to trust you in the future. Once you develop a reputation for doing immoral things, your status in the group is in jeopardy, and in the long run, your survival and reproduction opportunities will be limited if you develop a bad reputation. So the human self has to develop this control capacity, the free will, to learn what's the right thing to do in order to be accepted in the group and derive its benefits. We have a series of studies that we're doing some replications now, thanks to the suggestions of reviewers, and we hope to get this, satisfy them and get this into press in the next year. But anyway, the findings are that indeed, when people contemplate bad actions by other people, their own belief in free will goes up. So that's when you think of free will, is when you see someone not doing what they're supposed to. If somebody does something wrong, but it's to a bad person, then we think that's okay. We don't necessarily approve in principle of the wrong action, but if it victimized somebody bad at some gut level, that doesn't boost our sense of free will. That we should restrain that. Immoral acts increase the belief of free will. Immoral people, seeing the picture of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, people like that, that increases belief in free will compared to seeing Gandhi and Mother Teresa and other admired sorts of people. So again, even though we evolved the free will, I argue, to do the good things, it's when seeing people do the bad things that's what makes people think, oh, that's free will, because that's when we think, oh, that person should have acted differently. It really highlights the importance. And done these studies with reading hypothetical vignettes or reflecting on experiences from your own life. But even at the level of international statistics on crime and so on, countries that have higher belief in free will have higher murder rates, higher crime rates, and also higher rates of putting people in prison. And it's not just the United States is the one outlier that drives all these. You can take the United States out and just do other countries, and the result is still significant, although weaker. Again, it looks at that sort of level, where there's a need to punish people, where people are doing bad things. That's when we need to affirm the reality of free will so that we can hold them responsible and try to enforce the rules of our society. So again, this shows why people believe in free will, extends some of our past understandings about responsibility and so on, and suggests a way that free will beliefs can be increased. All right, what else have we got here? So, just to finish and sum up, free will is an important topic for positive psychology and indeed for psychology as a whole to understand. It's not something we should try to have bizarre metaphysical arguments about or try to explain it as an exemption from causality. People object to the idea of free will because of these somewhat idiosyncratic definitions of it, and you know, they're correct. Some people have used those definitions and said free will means you're exempt from causality, but that's not what we need for a scientific theory. A scientific theory will be a causal theory. So we can understand it as something that's natural, not supernatural, or natural combined with cultural, a natural adaptation to make culture possible is really the way to think about most of the distinctively human traits. And free will would be a very prominent one in there, because a new way of controlling our behavior is vital for creating all this wonderful culture, you know, including things like this very hotel and this conference. Other species don't do anything like this. So the new way of controlling our behavior has been vital to who we are and who we've become as a species. The new capacities for do these had to evolve from the simpler forms that animals have and show, like the simple choices that animals make of here and now agency. We're able to do it projecting on the future, using symbolic reasons, using religious, using moral, historical, political, all these sorts of things unknown in other species, but really vital to the success of human behavior. Belief in free will, as we've seen empirically, supports behavior that's beneficial to culture, that helps make the system work. So not only the reality of free will, but also beliefs about it are conducive to making society function better, and stimulated in part by the impulse to hold people responsible for their misdeeds. In this way, I think we can begin to construct and develop a scientific theory of free will that recognizes this remarkable, powerful, unique human capacity that's been instrumental in enabling our species to flourish and prosper and become as successful it is in biological terms, and becomes thus a central and core part of what makes us human. Thank you.